Welcome to our Near-Death Experience interview series. I'm Robert Mays. Suzanne and I have researched near-death experiences for the past 15 years. We're currently interviewing people who have had an NDE and who have also received visions of future world events. The interviews are part of our research project, which was approved by the Academic and Research Committee of IANS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. In these interviews, we're exploring NDErs' insights into the deeper meaning of the challenges currently facing humanity, such as the pandemic, the current social and economic challenges, and the political polarization of our society. What advice do NDErs have for coping with and responding to these challenges? We'll take a pause here to bring in today's guest.
We are here again with Rabbi Stephen Robbins of Congregation Neve Shalom in Los Angeles. Stephen is also a clinical psychologist with a specialty in the psychoneuroimmunology of trauma, bringing together the spiritual, the physical, and brain development and helping patients respond to trauma. Stephen has had a total of 7 NDEs in his life. During each NDE, he received a prophetic vision or message, which we wish to explore. Welcome, Rabbi Robbins.
Thank you for having me back to continue this. I'm very grateful and humbled by your desire to hear of my experiences.
So we'll jump right in and ask you to describe your second NDE. When and how did it occur?
I was just turning 20, so this would be in this would be in early 1963 through 64. I got a massive infection of hepatitis. And I was camping in Northern California. So by the time I got to Los Angeles, which is where I wanted to be, and they put me into St. John's Hospital, I was running a temperature of 107. In those days, they didn't have the breakdown of one hepatitis or another. They simply called it infectious hepatitis. And they had me packed in ice for a week and assumed that I would not survive. And I actually had 2 NDE experiences in that period of being packed in the ice with that enormous fever. And then when I came out of it, the doctors told me that 90% of my liver had been destroyed and that I would not survive, and that there was nothing they could do for me except give me shots of the earliest form of gamma globulin, and that I should withdraw from all that I was doing. By that time, I was in my 3rd year of rabbinic school and my 3rd year at UCLA, and had a congregation, but I had to withdraw from all of that. I tried to go back in September, and by October, I was simply back running a fever and in enormous pain. And so I withdrew and ended up, for a variety of reasons, living with my father in an apartment in Marina del Rey, which in 63, 64 had no apartments, no slips, no boats. I was really isolated, and my father was traveling all the time. So I essentially lived alone most of that year, and even forgot how to speak to people. But the apartment was on the ground floor with a green grass play area and looked straight up the main channel. And I used to spend hours sitting in the sun and in the wind, looking at that water and floating away in and out of those NDEs that I experienced in the hospital. And of course, by the end of the year, my liver had regenerated itself, which they didn't understand in that time. And I returned to school that following year and resumed my studies and my work.
Can you describe something of your experience during those two episodes that you had in the hospital?
The first episode was to remind me of my first NDE at my birth,
Right.
and to remind me that every NDE was to teach me about the deeper meaning of my purpose, my mission, or my tikkun, coming from the verb which means to repair or put together that part of existence which was unfinished or broken. And again, it revolved around being a healer of some form or another. And at that point, anything I could do about healing, I was told by my grandmother to never tell anybody about my background, who I was, what had happened to me until the turn of the century, because she said the message from her father, my great grandfather, was if you tell anybody before the turn of the century, they think you're crazy and no one will listen to you.
Yeah.
And so I never told anybody about any of this, as I told you, until 2005 with my third lung collapse and my fifth NDE. And then 2018 when I met Dennis Purcell and entered into the IONS community.
Can you describe the experience of the prophetic vision that you had during these NDEs?
Yes. So in the first NDE, what I learned was that I was to be given a vision of what was to come and my role in it. And then, but the role was not established. The question was asked, would I accept the role that I was given because it would push me out of conventional society as a rabbi and might even lead to my being expelled from rabbinic school and having to find another path. That was an enormous challenge. And when I came back, the question I struggled with was I willing to give up what I had been working for years to establish in order to fulfill the expectations that were implicit in the nature of my soul? And when I said to my guides, my shomrim, that I was willing to relinquish everything because it wasn't a sacrifice, it was a gift, that whatever I didn't need anymore that would take me to the next place was no longer important. In that, I learned an enormous lesson, and that is what we lose, or what we seem to lose, is what we no longer need or is necessary, which leaves an opening for what it is we are to gain. So if we're all filled up with everything, then nothing new can enter. And so there's a drain, and that drain leaves room for the entrance of something else. And being willing to relinquish my life as I'd been building it since I was 16 seemed an appropriate thing to do because of whatever was awaiting me, of which I had no specific idea. I loved the life I was living in a whole variety of ways, but I surrendered it. And then I had the second NDE. And in the second one, moving through the 5 dimensions of relinquishing my physicality and entering a level of universal consciousness that I had never experienced before, except for my becoming a soul. I was given a vision of the earth wrapped in a war that nobody in America wanted, but that was really a battleground between the two forces in the world, both of which possess those nuclear weapons, and that this battleground, which took place in a small country in Southeast Asia, would be the testing ground about who was more powerful. And that this war would tear the United States apart because there were those who wanted to fight it, and there were those who believed that it was a war that was not necessary and that it fed into the conflict that the people who wanted to dominate the world could win. And I was told that if I chose to come back, that my task was to step away and to become part of those who rebelled against the war itself, and more importantly, the American government that supported it.
And of course, we're talking about the Vietnam War then.
We're talking about the Vietnam War and this enormous conflict between the American nuclear arsenal and the Russian nuclear arsenal, which was what was behind the Vietnamese War. And the enormous failure of Johnson to keep us from the absurdity of the war, and the enormous accomplishments that he had made in terms of social programs, accomplishments that were the equivalent of FDR, who was his mentor, all got overshadowed by his being seduced into this Vietnamese War, which then opened the path for Richard Nixon, who was only concerned with himself. He was preoccupied with his own place, his own centrality in the world power. And so we entered the Vietnam War in order to win it. And it was only after the years of failure that it was clear that what he was doing was in fact failing. And then came Watergate and all of the revelations of the corruption and the dishonesty. And in those years, I was part of the anti-war movement. And I could show you pictures of me with long hair. And there was one incident where I was arrested by the FBI for federal conspiracy because we were demonstrating against a munitions plant, and we were warned to handcuff ourselves to the fence, but not handcuff ourselves so the gate wouldn't open. If you handcuffed yourself to the fence, was trespassing. But if you handcuffed yourself to the gate so the gate was closed, that was a federal crime, and that it was very serious. And of course, you know what I did. I went and handcuffed myself, and I handcuffed the gate shut.
Oops.
And the police came up to me and the FBI, and they said, "Do you have the key?" And I looked in my pockets and I said, "Gee, I really don't know where it is." And they said, "If you don't unlock it, we're going to arrest you for conspiracy, which is a federal crime, and we'll take you away." And I said, "Well, I can't find the key." So they cut the manacles, they arrested me. And what's different in those years was that instead of being arrested and going into an arraignment, they took you to a federal magistrate. And the federal magistrate dealt with the nature of your crime and decided to prosecute or not. So I was taken into the federal magistrate, whose name I believe was Epstein or Rosenberg. And it was a long time ago. And the prosecutors also had a Jewish name like Schwartz. And when the federal prosecutor said, "Mr. Robbins, will you rise so we can read the indictment against you?" My attorney stood up and said, Your Honor, would you please address Mr. Robbins by his honorific? So the judge kind of went surprised and he said, Mr. Robbins has an honorific. What is his title? And he said, this is Rabbi Stephen Robbins. And the judge's mouth fell open and he looked at the prosecutor who went, who knew? And the judge called a sidebar and they came up and they talked and they came back and he said, Rabbi Robbins, case dismissed. And I started to object and my attorney put one hand over my mouth and the other in back of my head and pulled me out and said, shut the F up. Otherwise, you're going to go to jail for 25 years. You got a gift. Now go and do what you need to. And so they released me. And I continued to demonstrate as I had years before when I demonstrated for the Civil Rights March and was arrested. So that I knew that social unrest in America was fundamental to reestablishing the balance of equity. Otherwise, America would harden into this structure that would never change. And I learned that from my experience in my NDE from an old relative who was a Sephardic Jew who escaped the Inquisition and ended up in Brazil.
Now
This
was during your NDE, you had this connection with the relative? Yes.
And in this, a piece of history I knew no longer became history. It became part of my experience and is fundamental to the nature of America. When the Jews in Brazil learned that the Santa Hermandad or the Inquisition was coming to Brazil, the Jews who were basically located in the city of Recife all left to go to the Low Countries, Amsterdam in particular. One of the last ships to leave was the one my relative was on, and it was in late summer, early fall, which of course you know is hurricane season.
Oh, yeah.
And the ship was beset by a great storm. And by a miracle, they came through and they were at a land they never knew of. And they sailed into a great bay to an island and were met by a peg-legged chairman of the city, whose name was Peter Stuyvesant. And this was New Amsterdam. And when they told the story, Stuyvesant said, hold on, you're Jews, you can't stay here. Jews are not welcome here. And the Jews knew that that was not the case because many of the Jews who left the early Inquisition in the middle 1200s and later in 1492 went to the Low Countries because Jews were welcome there. And Jews were part of the mercantile system of the Low Countries. So they pled for Stuyvesant to give them time to recuperate because of all the ill people, to let the ship go back to Amsterdam for refitting, and then it would return and bring them back. So Stuyvesant relented and sent letters to the Dutch West India Company saying that he was letting them stay, but then they had to leave. What Stuyvesant didn't know was half of the board of governors of the Dutch West India Company and the investors were Jews. So our relatives wrote letters, which the ship also took back. And when the ship returned, it had a packet of letters for Stuyvesant that fundamentally said either make the Jews burghers, which means citizens, or get on the ship and come home. which of course Stuyvesant didn't want to do. And so to make the Jews burghers meant that they had all of the rights and obligation of being a burgher, an equal citizen. And that means they were given a place on the wall to guard. And so they were given a place on the southern wall, and there they settled. Now, the question arises, what is the first thing that Jews are obligated to build when they settle in a new place? So what would you think?
Synagogue.
Holy place.
Yes.
A cemetery.
A cemetery.
Cemetery. And the cemetery is still there.
Oh.
And it goes back to the 1600s. It is the Sephardic Jewish cemetery, and it's off the street next to the wall where they protected. You want to know the name of that street? It's called Wall Street. And the Jews became a fundamental part of the building of America. And when the British came, unlike the ban against Jews in England, the Jews were welcomed in America. And Jews had been fundamental in all of the American Revolution, providing funds to Washington, et cetera, et cetera. And all of Jewish history in America has essentially been taken out of the American history books. For example, the man who started the labor union, Samuel Gompers, who was a Jewish refugee fleeing from Russian oppression, is called a Russian immigrant. So part of what I learned was that my role as part of my tikkun was to speak out against the kind of inequities and inequalities that I saw developing in America that Jews had experienced in Europe, so that America from its inception would not be like Europe, which was eventually a Holocaust for Jews.
Right.
And so I spent my life working for just that. And from the 60s through the 80s, late 80s, I worked from one social issue to another until finally, as a Hillel director in 1969, I was the first rabbi, actually among the first people, to begin to encounter, study, and speak out against cults. And ended up being so hated by the cults because I testified against them that Scientology and Unification Church and others would pray for my death every day. But I knew that if I did not speak up from my position, that my silence was consent.
Consent.
That silence is consent. As one of our great teachers, Joshua Heschel, teaches, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And those who are silent bear responsibility. And so I've never shut up. And even at the expense of my several positions I held, I spoke up for what I thought was right. And that was what I learned as I returned from my NDE in '64. And it was a lesson that I experienced, but was never sure how to enact. And as I developed more and more rabbinic history, more and more social involvement, especially as a campus rabbi at the University of Cincinnati in their psych department, and then later as the Hillel director at UC Berkeley and teaching at the Graduate Theological School of the Jesuit School of Theology and Bible, I was able to open up that whole Berkeley area to the issue of cults. And we were able to counteract the enormous cult activity that was taking hundreds of kids away, and they were disappearing from their families. So that when I came to Los Angeles in 78, I was part of the establishment of a Jewish Federation task force on cults and one for the reform movement, which saved hundreds of kids. And I myself was responsible for saving over 700 kids from cults, including going in and abducting kids who were being beaten as infants and taking them to the sheriff's department while being chased over the desert in jeeps while being shot at. So I knew that my task was to take up causes that nobody else wanted to be involved in.
Now this,
And that was part of what led me to IONS,
yeah,
was this sense of being part of the need to open up the hidden knowledge of the truth of reality and its transcendence so that it could spread through the world and create a new level of consciousness.
So now, out of your second NDE and the context of what's happening in the United States today, year 2020, what insights or advice would you give to the citizens of this country about the social and political polarization in our society?
We are, if you take what I had learned from each of my NDEs and the one in 87, 91, and in 05, that one could see the gradual tearing apart of the American fabric, led by those on the radical religious right, who were instrumental in getting people elected to office who were not interested in maintaining the equality of American standards, but were more interested in their own agendas for what America should be. And I worked very hard against Ronald Reagan because he was also a neighbor of mine growing up in the Palisades. I knew that he was a tool of the radical religious right, the moral majority, and that we had to take a stand against it. A story about it that nobody ever heard before, which I will share with you. In the second presidential election, I was still the chairman of the task force on cults and missionaries, both for the Southern California Board of Rabbis, for the Southern California Jewish Federation, for the Reform Movement. And I spoke out in a very intense sermon about why Jews should not vote for Ronald Reagan, that what he represented ultimately would lead not through his administration, but through others to an anti-democratic position.
now this was in 84 that you were speaking out.
Yeah,
Okay.
but what happened then was that I arranged for speakers to come from both parties. Immediately from the Democratic Party, because of my contacts and participation, Ted Kennedy agreed to come and speak at the synagogue. So when I called my Jewish friends who were involved in the Republican side, they couldn't believe it. And so they arranged for Jean Kirkpatrick to come. If you remember Jean, she was really a substantial intellect, one of the few people in the Reagan administration who had really solid credentials. Mm-hmm. And 5 days before her program, in a meeting of the Cult Commission, I was given the news that Jean Kirkpatrick's son was in Rajneesh in Oregon, and that he had been taken because there was a program of sending women out and getting young men involved sexually and then bringing them back to Oregon, and that Rajneesh and others in particular were targeting the children of political figures so that they could have influence.
Oh,
And so when they got her son, they contacted her and said, "We expect you to support our agenda." And she didn't know what the agenda was, but I did. The agenda was to get a member of Rajneesh elected to the House of Representatives during that election. And that's why they had taken over the town and the county of Antelope, Oregon. And there was a real civil war developing between the Rajneesh encampment and the farmers around them. So I met with at the request with the governor of Oregon and explained what was going on. So when Jean Kirkpatrick spoke and she was leaving, I hadn't told her before. I put my hand on her arm and I said, "Excuse me, Madam Secretary, but I know where your son is." And she went like this and she said, "What do you want from me? What do you want?" And suddenly out behind the secretary to the UN came the mother. And of course, the Secret Service people around her, approached me and she pushed them back. And she said, "What are you talking about?" So I explained to her who I was and what I was doing. And I said, "I'm here to help. There are ways to help get your son out if you want to know." So she said, "In an hour, come to my hotel room and meet with me and we'll talk." So I got a friend of mine who at that point was my co-chair, Maynard Bernstein, and we went and we met with her for 2 hours.
wow.
And the one thing I said to her is, if you want to put an end to Rajneesh, you send the Immigration Service in, led by the Department of Justice, and you demand to see their passports, etc. And what you'll find is that they have no legal status in the United States. And so they sent the people in, and understand that compound in Antelope was a military fortress. I mean, they had people walking around with machine guns. They had all kinds of ex-military people, especially Israelis. And they were really set up to defend themselves. So when the federal government came in, they had nothing to do. And when they discovered who Rajneesh really was and what he had been building there, including his own crematoria, his excuse was, "Well, in India, we burn them and scatter their ashes, and that's part of a religious ritual." It meant that there were people dying, but nobody knew about it. And I had film from the Rajneesh cult in India that had been made by the BBC. And when I showed that to everybody, they just went crazy. And so because of my connection with Jean Kirkpatrick, and then the Attorney General called me and they asked me to be part of the FBI exploration into cults. And against my better judgment, I agreed. They ended up closing down Rajneesh and deporting him and his other people away, including his 27 Rolls Royce, and sent him to Western Australia, where he eventually died. And but that position led to the information which eventually put Sun Myung Moon in jail for 16 months and other things. And I ended up testifying in court against a number of cults. But all of that was part of this learning that I got in '64 that said that the United States was going to be under attack in ways that it never expected. So the whole point that I made about combating cults was not about freedom of religion. I said freedom of religion is freedom from governmental interference in religion. It is not a license to steal souls. And when I put it that way, both in local superior federal court, it had a profound effect. I said, I'm not here to plead about any case. I'm here to plead about the law itself. And so we made a lot of progress. And I was threatened with death a good number of times. One group of ex-Israeli commandos who were Scientologists, after a presentation I made, came to me, and one of them said, Rabbi, you should be careful. You know, your life could be in jeopardy. And I looked at him and I said, do me a favor. Please do me a favor. He said, what? And I said, kill me. So he backed up. He said, what do you want? Kill me. I said, kill me. He said, why? And I said, because if you kill me, it will put an end to Scientology. And he turned around, he and his friends, and they ran away, except for two of them who stayed and who eventually came out of Scientology along with others. So that was not just part of my political history. It is part of the tikkun that I was warned about, that we would be attacked from a whole series of places that we were not prepared for. That leads us to the present. What we see in Donald Trump and the collapse of the Republican Party is this dark, vicious underbelly, which has been in America since the collapse of slavery, of resentment and hatred against all aliens, all colored, all those who are not Christian. That meant Catholics too, who needed to be stopped from coming. And that history and the language of Donald Trump is the same. Yeah. Look up something called the Know Nothing movement, and you'll see Donald Trump sounds like the Know Nothing movement in the 1840s. Don't believe anything you read or you hear from New York or Boston or the eastern cities, because they're controlled by the immigrants and by the Jews. And Donald Trump is a know-nothing, but he's also more than that. And it's not him by himself. It's all of those who work to place him in power against the feeling in America that this could never happen, happened to teach us that we had taken our democracy, our freedom for granted. And Donald Trump came to show us that you can't take what's precious for granted. That what we face, both in climate change, in the coronavirus, in the enormous storms and fires we face in America, in economic collapse, and the unwillingness of the Trump-like minions to deny that any of this is happening, is part of what evil is all about. Evil is really about confusing what is perception of the truth and what's a lie until you can't tell the difference. And when you can't tell the difference, you ultimately surrender yourself to the one who says, I know the answers. I know better than anybody else. And so all of the world is in this place now. And the one place where it can be changed is here in America, in which the American people choose to return back to what was the original American Revolution. Because what I was told coming back in my last two NDEs that began in '64 and later in 87 and 91 and '05 was that there were forces working to tear this all apart from places we weren't prepared for, like the insidious manipulation of the Russians about our election system, etc., and our unwillingness to see how vulnerable we are, and that the Republican Party, and I don't mean it as a party, but the people who took over were committed to dumbing down the American populace by essentially destroying public education so that the vast majority of people being educated in America did not understand what the history of America, not the country, but the dream, the commitment of equality, of fraternity, of the right to life and the pursuit of happiness was something that was an inalienable right. And what we're facing now is all of existence coming apart in every dimension we can possibly think of. And it is we who are given the chance to save it and turn it around. What is the most telling of all of this is that as the disruptor, which is what the Hebrew word for evil is, disruption, tearing things apart. As the disruptor reveals himself and the others around him to be that, to tear it apart, the more it's known who they are and what they are. And the question is, will not just the American public, but America and then all of the rest of the world population begin to heal themselves and the world we live in? Because at this moment, that began for me with the precognition knowledge about the nuclear explosion, learned that it is not a nuclear war that will destroy the world. It is that the good people of the world will be so anesthetized by wealth and the world's possessions that all of this illness will come together and it will overwhelm us and we will feel helpless. The message I got when I was told to come to IONS was to say, IONS and all of its knowledge is a base by which we can overcome the fear of death and understand that the death images we live with are illusory and are used against us. And it's our responsibility to teach the world what life really means and how to get the most from it. And I have been so astounded at the reception that IONS has provided me. I'm just so overwhelmed and grateful. I hope that answers some of your question.
Yes, and the point about death, from the perspective of near-death experiences, is that we are spiritual beings, we are eternal spiritual beings, NDErs say, and that we do not die. So the death of the physical body is really just a transition into a higher dimension, and that death is not what people are fearing it is, as annihilation. But we cannot be annihilated. We are eternal beings.
That is precisely the case. And once we understand, as our tradition puts it, that the body is a shoe for the soul's foot, means that the rest of our soul is being held for us, waiting for, as we transcend among one of the 5 levels of physicality, to become the universal consciousness that each of us possess, which has been denied us by culture, by all of the standards that work against our sense of personal value and our own personal immortality.
So I have a feeling that we are out of time here. We've certainly had an interesting discussion. We'll have to continue this um, in another interview and go through some more of your NDEs.
I look forward to it because each one expands and amplifies what it is that I told you that happened in 64. And when you put the dates of 87, 91, and 05 together, and then uh, January of 2018, and now May 7th of this year, each one is a precursor from the next stage of the world's challenges.
Then that's what we will be as an outline for future interviews with you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for your willingness to hear me.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and take good care of yourself.
Yes.
I am.
All right.